literal and radical verbal hygiene. Now we come back to verbal hygiene. We discussed it with reference to gender. We said there is no need of any kind of verbal hygiene rules separately if we ensure commitment to style rules, because they focus on transparency and fairness. So when there is transparency and fairness, there is no need of any kind of language washing or language cleaning. But here we are talking about if a situation where we need to wash the language. If some kind of transparency is spoiled, artificially introduced, so definitely language washing is required. It would be the result of violation of style rules. So transparency will be spoiled. If transparency is absent, so verbal hygiene should intervene. So that's why we are taking it again. Verbal hygiene can be of two types. It can be radical, it can be liberal. There are two purposes of language reform. Language cleaning, language reform, and verbal hygiene, they are similar. Number one, two purposes. First purpose is language is natural because it reflects reality, but we may introduce imperfection in it. So when we do so, we should restore its perfection. This is called liberal verbal hygiene. So when you remove imperfection from natural language, perfect language, so this is called liberal verbal hygiene. Second, the purpose of language reform is that language is not natural, not perfect. We need to reform it not to restore its perfection, but for clarity and fairness. So now see the difference between the two purposes and the role of verbal hygiene accordingly. So if the case is like this, the verbal hygiene that you now need is called radical verbal hygiene. For example, we think language is natural because it reflects gender reality. If we say, know a client's needs before you give him advice, so you are using generic he. Here, him excludes women. It only refers to males because this is for masculine. So we use a neutral term. We have to mend it, correct it. We will use such gender term which would be inclusive, which would include both genders. Then it would represent reality. So you will say, know a client's needs before you give them advice. Them would include both. But if we say that this inclusive use is not all right, we should refer to both sexes separately. So we are going to be radical in our language cleaning. For example, you would like to say, know a client's needs before you give him or her advice. So this is slightly radical kind of verbal hygiene. If we say, the third thing is, if we say that her is as generic as he covers both sexes, so her can also cover both sexes. So if we commit to this kind of stance, so we would say, know a client's needs before you give her advice. And if you read books these days, you will find such kind of generic use of he and she and her. But this is totally unconventional, unusual, and something that is totally against convention. You call it radical. So this kind of verbal hygiene, if you clean language like this from a gender preference or bias, this would be radical verbal hygiene.